And we are live. We are live. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being with us today at the final keynote session for Build Peace 2020, Cape Town in principle and online in practice. So with me today, I've got Thami Nkosi, who's a social justice activist, been on the ground for 15 years with experience in movement building and really the development of campaigns in the civil society sector. His expertise and focus at the present is in cybersecurity, surveillance, and the right to freedom of assembly, with an interest in understanding surveillance capitalism, really understanding the animal that is the surveillance capitalism issue and topic as it plays out in the world, regionally here in South Africa, and individually at a personal level for all of us. And recognizing that Thami is currently with the Right2Know Campaign, which was launched back in August of 2010. And this campaign has grown into a movement centered on that freedom of expression and access to information. So Right2Know recognizes that at the heart of all activist campaigning and advocacy is clear and concise information from the spaces that hold power and hold sway over society. And so with keeping to that commitment, the Right2Know Campaign continues to mobilize around three main focuses: that is, advancing protest rights, communication rights, and specifically a participatory focus and approach to the practice of democracy in our country, in South Africa. So with that in mind, I'd also like to share that in the past weeks, in correspondence with Thami and some of the information and details that he's shared with me so far, I myself feel like I've been activated and motivated to arm myself and be more aware of this idea of self-defense in an age of surveillance capitalism and digital times that we live in. So on that note, thank you so much for being here with us, Thami, and we really look forward to this dialogue. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fergus, and good afternoon to everybody who's joined us today. And I think not an easy topic to chat about. And I think I remember I was saying to you, this is by far one of the most elitist in its very nature conversation that essentially leaves a whole chunk of people behind. And yeah, I'm hoping at least today, I will have a dialogue with everybody that's joined us today to kind of really try and simplify this and to try and rally everybody behind understanding the animal that is surveillance capitalism, or surveillance in its very nature. So yeah, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be able to have a conversation with everybody. And yeah, looking forward to what I hope would be fruitful engagement. I hope the little contributions that I make will assist a whole lot of people to at least have some level of understanding with regards to surveillance and how that takes part in our lives and some of the things that we can do. Just as a side note, to just simply say, I'm hoping to just more or less kind of go through just a global context of surveillance capitalism and what we understand about that. And the answer, I don't give the answers, but just more or less to say, how can I reflect on that? And then at the second part of my chat here will be to try and look at the contextualized, aspect of it in as far as South Africa is concerned and how we experience in that. But the key of it is for me to try and kind of localize it and have a conversation about the lived experiences of people on the ground around the issues of surveillance. So yeah, with that said, I think I will start by trying to at least paint a picture, or at least a picture from my own understanding, so that we can foreground this conversation. So perhaps the first question, usually when people ask, what is surveillance capitalism? And I don't think none of us have the answers with regards to what it is specifically, but we may have notions of understanding certain aspects of it. So in general, we have different understandings of what surveillance capitalism is. And I don't think anybody that thinks around this question has a wrong answer, but essentially we may have different understandings that builds the broader body of knowledge for us to understand the concept, and that's the beauty of it. That we don't have a one way in which we understand, or the one definition of what we understand by surveillance capitalism. And the way I think about it is that surveillance capitalism is a form of tyranny that feeds on people but does not do any good for people. So this is a form of tyranny that feeds on people, but it's not for the people. So it's something that is perpetuated by a group of capitalistic, corporations, capitalistic institutions, to feed off our own personal information, to feed off our own personal engagements in life. And generally, it does not benefit us in any way. I think there's been arguments to say, well, with the move into a much more artificial intelligence world, we need, all kinds of technologies. But eventually, what we then have to ask ourselves is to say there's a huge component of surveillance that happens with every development of technology. And as a result, we need to ask ourselves, up to what level is this form of technology even being beneficial to us in the main, and then how we experience our lives. So for me, I think we need to understand that surveillance capitalism is essentially a motion to simply commodify people's personal data, and the sole purpose of it is profit making. There's absolutely nothing else outside of it except for kind of really commodifying our personal information and data for profiteering for these different corporations that are involved in that. At the later stage, we'll have a little bit of a conversation and perhaps some examples of what corporations are we referring to. And perhaps one would also ask the questions, what are the current contexts in which we live in, and how do we then understand surveillance capitalism to sort of unfold in our lives? And the truth of the matter is that we're living through the most profound transformation in our information environment, right? So in the information environment that we're living through, it's a very profound space in which corporations are thriving on the monetization of our information. And not only monetization of our information, but also monetization of our lives. We live in a huge web of metadata gathering. So essentially what is happening is that we have information trading, but what the information trading is not done by us, but it's done by big tech companies. Essentially, they're trading in our own personal information, exchanging our information for their own gain. And we're living through a system that works by providing a so-called free service that billions of us, cheerfully use. And as a result, it enables these providers of these services to monitor our behavior, to monitor our use of these tools as well. And often this is done without an explicit consent. And we're living in an era, quite frankly, where surveillance capitalism sort of unilaterally claims human experiences as a free raw material for translation into behavioral data. So not only are we, subjected to all kinds of platforms that are provided for us for free, and we opt to use them, but even though we don't consent to these things, what ultimately surveillance capitalism thrives on is to unilaterally claims that data of ours and claims our own experiences as we feed into these platforms, and uses that as raw material and translate it into behavioral data for them. And that's how they manage to do things like behavioral predictions and all kinds of things. I don't know how many comrades here have seen the Social Dilemma documentary. It speaks specifically around how this behavioral data is actually used to predict human behavior, to actually channel us to think in a particular way, to sell us certain things that we may not necessarily need. So in essence, it's universal mind control, even though it's done without explicit consent. And essentially this is sold to us as a platform for, to better our lives, and it's for free and everything else. But we're paying the price by giving away our own personal information. We're paying the price by giving away our own privacy right. And perhaps maybe we could look at, just a couple of examples of what big tech companies are doing or are saying about our right to privacy and protection of personal information. At the backdrop of Cambridge Analytica, comrades would remember that there was a whole hoo-ha about, the data that actually surfaced as a result. Microsoft, for example, Google, and Facebook, all they're doing is nothing less than spawning a variant of capitalism. So quite frankly, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, in as much as they're selling us a product that simply says this is meant to enhance your life, this is meant to make your life better, but all they're actually doing, in fact, is spawning a variant of capitalism. So in essence, our personal data, our privacy has become a commodity for them, and they monetizing that, and they actually using that for profit, as I've said earlier on. And we have arrived at the place where, quite frankly, we cannot even measure the effects of this digitized world and how much is actually taking off us, and how much is actually even informing us in terms of future behaviors and how we understand ourselves and how we live our lives and how we understand the components of our lives. And we become very heavily reliant on these platforms, on these social tools or these social media tools, to a point where we do not see our lives functioning outside of them. And that's when we essentially feeding as much data as possible and essentially generating far much more profit than these corporations would have anticipated, primarily because there's this selling off of saying it's a free, free to use platform. You can use it however you want and everything else. But the truth of the matter is that it's done in a way that it's essentially just gathering information from us. One could also problematize something like Google, for instance, that has decided that it will digitize and store every book ever printed, right? And they would do that regardless of copyright issues. So not only would they digitize these books, but they would also rob off, profits from the authors of these books, because then they become easily available on Google, they become easily available online, and there's copyright infringement issues that are not necessarily even spoken about. So not only are they gathering data about us, but also stifling us as citizens, as global citizens who may write books, who may write manifestos, whatever it is that we write, and they digitize this, and as a result, they then make profit off that. So every time somebody clicks on that book to try and read that book, Google makes money instead of the person that wrote that book, and that in itself is very problematic. And that we also see that you use your Google Maps, for instance, and we need to really kind of think about this. What does this mean when Google has a photograph of every street and every house on the planet without having asked for permission, right? So you go to Google Street View, for instance, your house shows up, but nobody has come to you to say, we asking for permission that anybody that logs on to Google can then be able to see the view of your house or your home. And essentially that's what Google kind of does, and they're making money off that. So in truth, what confronts us really is a phase in capitalism that's been a long evolution, right? From the making of products to mass production, to managerial capitalism, to services, to financial capitalism. And now what we're seeing is the exploitation of behavioral predictions, covertly derived from surveillance of users. So there's a continuum, and we cannot more or less kind of separate the connections that all these things have. When you're looking at the issue of mass production, when you're looking at issues of financial capitalism in itself, is at the back end of it kind of fuels what we call surveillance capitalism as well. So in essence, what we're facing off, it should be a collective of struggle that pushes back against any form of capitalization, whether of labor, whether of production, at the expense of humanity. And we're seeing this being manifesting itself through the surveillance use. And that's the reason why ultimately we then have to be able to see the connections to say the evolution of capitalism also has surveillance capitalism as part of it. It's not only financial, like I said, in any other form as well. But it's also connected to the surveillance capitalism, because it just simply makes money off our lives, the same way that the big bosses would make money off our labor, off our production. So we don't own the means of production. Simply here, we don't own the means of what's the production of the information that is there. It's then therefore owned by these big corporations, who then therefore use the data of ours for their own personal gain and their own financial gain. To problematize that even further is to say, half the time we usually think about surveillance capitalism as a form that is perpetuated by private companies. But the truth of the matter is that there is some relationship and there is some parallel between surveillance that is conducted by private companies as well as surveillance that is conducted by the state in itself. So you have a huge cloud where either you're under the microscopic eye and the generation of personal information and data that is done by the state, and you also have these private corporations doing the same thing. Sometimes, in most cases, quite frankly, at least in the past 3-4 years, we've seen them actually colluding together to exchange this information. We see government using these private corporations to access the data that they generate. And we're also seeing the state establishing their own surveillance sort of systems to be able to then therefore generate information and data and personal information of their own citizens, and essentially using that for whatever means and ends and purposes. Sometimes it's autocratic states that essentially want to know what the thinking of the nation is, what the thinking of the people is, and what people are into, and what people are doing, and where people are going. So as a way to clamp down on any form of dissent, but we'll talk about that a bit later. And also the other thing that we're seeing is that in democratic societies, there is some level of a small percentage of, some level of degree in which we can question or we can ask for oversight of both the state surveillance and the private surveillance. But quite frankly, we have almost no regulatory oversight of particularly Google, Microsoft, Facebook, you name them, right? So we have very little oversight. We may have some oversight on the state surveillance, but we have very little oversight on the privatized counterparts. And this should be specifically said, that this is not to be tolerated at all. That's the first problem that we have, to say to some degree we can, through the legislature, through citizen participation, go and hold accountable some level of state surveillance, but we have absolutely no power with regards to regulatory framework insofar as private companies actually conduct themselves. So that's something that I would like to flag, to everybody here, to say, what are some of the things that we can do to try and call for more greater accountability and get involved in the regulatory framework, and ultimately, how do citizens get involved in holding accountable the private corporations' surveillance? Because to some degree, in some democracies, we have some level of oversight over state surveillance as well. The other point being that in the battle to try and hold private surveillance to account, often what we see is that in the industry, you have all these role players who would essentially come up and say, yeah, well, we see when we start making noise, the Thamis of the world and other structures that try and make noise about private surveillance and the danger it poses and all the intricate difficulties with it insofar as them making money off us. Every time we try and call for some level of accountability, what you have is the industry players themselves coming forth and talking about, no, perhaps we could work together and work with government to try and find better regulation systems, and we could do to be a bit more open and actually open up the market. What they're essentially doing is shutting down on dissent, and it's shutting down on the conversation around accountability. Because what in essence we're faced with is more or less the same role players wanting to talk to us about accountability, but the same role players talking to us and actually wanting to lecture us on how best they can regulate themselves, when in fact they failed all along. The fact that we're here and we have concerns about these things, it simply means that they have not been doing a good job. So why do they want to bring us into a table and simply say, let's look at ways in which we can reform this and we can regulate it better? And my gripe with most of the tech gurus and the tech critics and stuff is that their language often speaks about trying to reform. And I'm saying, perhaps I'm a bit of a radical, but my view is that we don't need to reform, but we need to abolish surveillance. Because in my mind, better regulated surveillance and non-regulated surveillance has no difference. The truth of the matter is that surveillance remains surveillance. Whether it's regulated or it's not regulated, surveillance by its very nature is invasive. Surveillance by its very nature tramples upon human rights. So as a result, I don't see where the conversation about reform kind of fits in. And unfortunately, that's the conversation that we're having globally. When you go to different conferences, across the country, you go to different conferences across the globe. The conversation in this space is about reform, is about better regulation, and quite often, sometimes, these big corporations would call for self-regulation, because then they would make an example to say, no, but the media as the fourth estate essentially self-regulates, so we can self-regulate. And the truth of the matter is that we cannot afford to give them that much power. They've got enough power, well, not enough, they've got too much power that they shouldn't have in the first place. So for us, it's not to sit on the table and negotiate that, because I don't know how you appeal to a moral conscience of an oppressive force. Surveillance by its very nature is very oppressive. It's used by kleptocratic governments. It's used by autocratic governments all over the world to essentially spy on their citizens, to clamp down on dissent, and sometimes in worst case scenarios where you would have them sort of doing arbitrary arrests and all kinds of things. So I don't think the conversation around better regulation and all sorts of things is actually progressive or is beneficial to citizens of any country, of any society, because surveillance by its very nature is very problematic. And perhaps maybe just to raise another issue to say, this kind of reformist agenda, it's not necessarily helpful for us, because then what it simply means is that it wants us to believe that the logic of accumulation is not necessarily connected to surveillance capitalism. And the truth of the matter is that the logic of accumulation is implicit in surveillance capitalism. So even though we may reform, even though we may better regulate, the truth of the matter is that it's the accumulative aspect of surveillance capitalism that we need to actually push back against. And pushing back, it simply means then we must fight back and essentially claim our space, claim our rights, and demand that, in fact, to some level, this level of invasive capitalism, invasive surveillance capitalism actually gets abolished at some point. So the self-regulation is a non-starter. The reformist agenda is questionable in its intent with regards to how is that going to benefit the citizens? How is that going to benefit us as a people that are subjected to this as data subjects and everything else? So I think, therefore, the fight back against surveillance capitalism cannot have these very corporations at the forefront of finding solutions. They cannot be primarily because of the self-interest that's in it, and as a result, it will be very difficult to have a conversation with surveillance capitalism to capitalize a bit better. I don't know how that happens, and I don't think there's anything like that would happen when you're negotiating with capitalism to be a less capitalistic anymore. I don't see that happening. So I think to some degree, what we need is to build a global community of a collective fight back to actually push back against surveillance capitalism, to simply say we understand this form of capitalism the same way that we understood the financial capitalism, the same way that we understood slavery, the same way that we understand the workers' rights as being the ones that are generating the production, but not necessarily owning the means of production. So in essence, this is a connected fight back with all the struggles that we've been waging throughout the evolution or development of humanity. And as a result, we need to have the same vigor to kind of fight back against surveillance capitalism, because it's not here to benefit us, but what it does, it's take away from us and essentially subject us, make us subjects of a much bigger conspiracy, much bigger platform of making money for private corporations. And sometimes one would want to think about, quite frankly, what are, in as much as we talk about what we're seeing and what we understand surveillance, capitalism to be about, what are some of the imminent threats that perhaps we should brace ourselves for, sort of looking forward, and how best we can mitigate against these? And I think surveillance capitalism will move from a focus on individual users to a focus on populations, if it hasn't started to happen already. So this obsession with collecting individualized data and predicting behavior and selling products and doing all kinds of things is actually going to be worse off, in a way that is going to be focusing on populations, and is going to, at the micro level, it'll go in as far as focusing on cities and it's in themselves, and eventually is going to be blowing up to looking at the entire society as a whole. And I'm saying this with a caution to say, perhaps that's where we are. But at least at this level, there's a large information that we have that essentially tells us that, at least at this level, the majority of the focus is at an individual user level. But we need to be very careful that very soon this is going to be predicting behaviors of populations, controlling the thoughts of populations, controlling the functionalities of communities, of cities, and eventually all of humanity will be captured in one basket, where everybody else's information is making so much money for surveillance capitalism that we will not be able to even begin to imagine. And I'm saying that cautiously to say, perhaps that's where we are, but it's not necessarily at the mass scale. But those are some of the threats that we essentially are going to have to deal with moving forward. And the other thing is that there's a new drive towards economies of scope. And these economies of scope are going to be moving from desktop to mobiles, to out in the world, to when we drive, when we run, when we go shopping. And already we know we tap our cards when we purchasing groceries. It's moving to a point where you don't need a card anymore. You can have an app on your phone that you tap your phone even. And we all have these watches that we use all the time when we're running. And all we're doing is just generating information after information for all these big corporations, and they're exchanging it and they're making money out of it. And they're simply selling us to say, well, this watch will help you monitor your heart rate and all sorts of things. One would argue, yes, it does help, but to a degree that simply says the kind of information that you're actually punching into these devices that you have, it's going to bring a connection where these corporations are able to monitor every aspect of your life. And unfortunately, for example, I'm not sure how many folks would be aware that there is a system in China, for example, where they use for social credit, right? And this is precisely the kind of stuff that they do. So they have all these things connected to your watch, it's connected to your phone, it's connected to this, it's connected to that. And they can even read your mood as you run, and your heart rate. So they know everything about you, what your heart rate is, what doctor you use, where do you shop, what kind of foods do you eat. These are going to be very problematic for us moving forward. And not only at an individualized or perhaps community level or society level do we see these as problematic, but also surveillance capitalism has its tentacles interfering even with our democracy. One of the things is that surveillance capitalism depends upon undermining individual self-determination, autonomy, and decision-making processes. So in essence, surveillance capitalism, quite frankly, it's undermining of who we are, our ability to self-determine, our ability to control our own anatomy, and it influences our ability to make decisions. And unfortunately, in democratic societies, you get influenced. I mean, we've seen the use of bots to influence, in some cases, elections, and they actually predict patterns and how people view certain things. And that in itself has a dire effect in the long run in our ability to administer our own democratic, dispensations in our different countries and how we live our lives. So we also see that we're going to be trapped in an involuntary measure of personal necessity and economic extraction. And these are the same channels that we rely upon for our daily logistics, social interactions, our work, our education, our healthcare, our access to products and services, and much more. Now that we're living in the world that we're living in, quite frankly, we are involuntarily seeing a merger between all the different aspects of surveillance capitalism, essentially just controlling every area of our life. And we need to then therefore be in a position to push back against that. And I think there can be no exit from the process that is intentionally designed to bypass individual awareness and produce ignorance, especially when there are very few processes upon which we must depend on for effective daily living. So the truth of the matter is that these systems are intentionally designed to bypass our individual awareness, and they're designed to reproduce or produce mass ignorance. So as a result, we need to be very wary of these, because then in a democratic society, when you have processes that are intentionally designed to bypass individual awareness and produce ignorance, then it simply means that we're going to have the far right groups that have been emerging in the different countries that we're seeing in the world, primarily because of use of bots, primarily because of disinformation, and how that gets fed into a central point that becomes the modus operandi for certain groups. So not only is surveillance capitalism a threat to our democratic dispensation, but it is also a threat to world peace, in a sense that you see suddenly all these right-wing groups mushrooming all over the place, arming themselves, and essentially, attacking our very essence of our democracies as we live in the different parts of the world. I'll take you back to perhaps one quote that Mark Zuckerberg once said. And he specifically, deliberately said, privacy is no longer a social norm. And I'd like everybody that's present here to think about that. I'm not going to try and kind of break it down, but I think it's a very startling revelation to come out of Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Facebook, to say, what does it mean when a person says privacy is no longer a social norm? So what that means is that we cannot normalize having privacy. What we should be doing is consenting to be data subjects. We should have no level of expectation of the state, of companies, of anyone to protect our privacy. But then the question is, if privacy is a constitutional right for every citizen in this world, why do we then allow folks like Zuckerberg, who own corporations, specifically feeding into the machine that is surveillance capitalism, to tell us that privacy is no longer a social norm? And I think these are some of the dangerous things that get said all the time, and people kind of get away with that. And we need to ask ourselves to say, what's the best way in which we respond? Because clearly, any aspect of surveillance capitalism does not think that privacy or our privacy is important. They think of it as something that doesn't matter. They think of our personal information as something that they have a right to, and we have no right to protect. And that simply means that then we have to think about how best do we then do these things. And quite frankly, these are lines that are sold by surveillance capitalists. It's not only Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, you can think about folks like the Google folks and everybody else. The truth of the matter is that this is the language of surveillance capitalists. They don't think that our privacy matters. They don't think there's anything wrong with them using our data for their own financial gain. And we have to be alarmed by this, and we have to be angry about this, and we have to stand up and do something about it. But also, governments are advocating for mass surveillance of civilians. The truth of the matter is that, like I said earlier on, there's some level at which governments would collude with these companies, because these companies enable them to have a peep at thinking trends of their societies, or the thinking trends of their citizens, as well as behavioral trends, behavioral patterns. So essentially, using this kind of information to predict what we need as a society, what we don't need as civilians, and ultimately do some things that essentially would keep us under their control. And we need to be very wary about this thing, and how best we then are able to push back against this. When Mark Zuckerberg says privacy is no longer a social norm, my view is, I don't think that's true. I think everybody in this world has something to hide. And for me, I say, if you have nothing to hide, then you are nothing. You cannot live in a world where everything about you is known by everyone, everywhere, anyhow, including the intimate details that you don't want them to know. So if you have nothing to hide, and I hear people saying, well, I don't mind civilians or whatever because I've got nothing to hide. And the truth of the matter is, if you've got nothing to hide, then you've given away all of your rights. So you might as well just give away your right to life, right? Because if you don't have privacy rights, then you have nothing. So we should have something to hide. And also, everybody in this planet has something to hide. And that must be respected. If you don't want certain things to be known about us, they must remain private. They must remain out of the public domain. They must not be accessible to these corporations to monetize. And that's the other thing that we have to fight for. And the other thing is, what do we know of this and how much is spoken about, right? So we quite often faced with questions in communities that work in spaces that we try and converge and have conversations around the phenomenon of surveillance. The biggest worry for folks that we at least interact with is the invasiveness of surveillance, right? So part of the questions that are quite often posed to me and my other comrades that I work with is to say, when you say, all right, when you're thinking surveillance, what comes to mind, right? People call out words like, well, privacy, well, dystopia, well, control, well, monopoly, manipulation, intrusion, exploitation, misinformation, fear, freedom, power. And I think those phrases cannot begin to even explain to some degree the level and extent at which we are fearful as a society, and I think rightfully so. Anytime that we're thinking that we're being manipulated to doing something, anytime that we're thinking that this is a threat to our freedom, every time that we're thinking there's somebody who has power over us, every time that we're thinking we've been exploited, every time that we're thinking that this, something is threatening our democracy, anytime that we're thinking there's universal mind control, then we ought to be concerned. And these are some of the phrases that when you interact with people about the subject of surveillance, even at the simplistic level just of surveillance and moving away from capitalist, surveillance, these are the kind of phrases, and this is a cause for concern. Primarily because then it simply means that there is something for us to resist because we are fearful of how much surveillance is actually taking away from our lives. And that's the point at which we need to rally each other behind. That's the point at which we need to mobilize all of us to fight back against surveillance, because we are aware that we at the danger of living in a surveillance dystopia, and it's frightening for all of us. People think about these things, but I guess part of the question is people don't know what they can do about it. And I think it's good that people are starting to think about manipulation, intrusion in relation to surveillance, because the truth of the matter is that surveillance is those things and other things as well that may not necessarily be mentioned every time that we're speaking to folks about what they understand about surveillance, right? And then there are questions that are posed to us to say, yeah, well, we understand this is intrusive, this is doing this is doing that, but what is it that we can do? And I always have a one-liner to simply say, well, the first thing that is required of us is to tremble with indignation. We cannot just simply say, well, we're frightened that we're being manipulated and all sorts of things and all sorts of things. We need to show indignation as citizens. We need to show indignation as journalists. There needs to be a whole lot more writing around this subject matter. There must be scholars that do a whole lot more of, writing and research around the subject matter. And there must be a level of accountability for our lawmakers as well. So in essence, there need to be indignation that we're trembling with at all spheres, all levels of society, from ordinary citizens to journalists to scholars to citizens to lawmakers, to simply say we need to engage with this phenomenon because we understand that this is going to pose a serious danger to the freedoms that we've fought so hard for over the years to have in this country. And we need to use the same vigor. In my mind, I equate surveillance capitalism to the same thing as slave trade. So we need to make surveillance capitalism illegal the same way that we made slave trade illegal. And for me, perhaps that's an exaggeration, but for me, that's the extent at which we need to be able to be sparked into life, to fight back, to resist this form of surveillance, to resist surveillance actually monetizing our lives in that way. And we need to build global solidarity. We need to build continental solidarity. We need to build regional solidarity. We need to build community networks. We need to build national networks. What we need is a better mass popular education system in order to educate as many people as we possibly can, work with grassroots movement. We need to polarize every level of society against, in essence, spread our own propaganda to resist surveillance at all levels of society. And we need to kind of really think about how do we mobilize and how do we build movements to resist this at grassroots up. And we need to be able to build popular uprising and popular campaigns to actually resist the threat that surveillance capitalism is, will be, is and will be. The same way that we mobilize against racism, the same way that we mobilize against sexism, the same way that we mobilize against slavery, the same way that we mobilize against homophobia. We need to be shaken to be able to educate, mobilize, and be able to build a movement to fight against surveillance capitalism. And I think we need to involve everybody and anyone at all levels. We need academia to help us, unearthing this phenomena. We need lawmakers thinking about ways in which to resist this. We need to think about ways in which the masses can pull together and resist these and actually demand much more accountability from these corporations. And perhaps from the context just as of looking at surveillance capitalism, I would leave this subject matter before moving on to the second section of it with food for thought, right? When you think about Microsoft, how many computers are there in this world? How many people are on a Microsoft platform? You think about schools, you think about universities, you think about hospitals, you think about prisons, you think about firms, you think anything that you can think of. A company like Microsoft provides a platform which essentially gives them access to that level of information about people all over the world. And that's a big problem. You think about biometric systems, usually Microsoft-based. You think about computer softwares used in hospitals to capture information of patients. You think about school registrations, universities and everywhere. This is a Microsoft platform. And the truth of the matter is that Microsoft has amassed so much data of human beings in this life, in this world, that is beyond imagination. And these are some of the companies that we should be able to mobilize against and resist, because they have way too much information about everybody, primarily because they provide a particular platform. But they're not providing this platform. Essentially, every time that they're selling it is about, we're providing this platform to make things easier to capture, blah, blah, blah. But the truth of the matter is that it makes money for them. Now, suddenly, they're centralizing all kinds of information. Can we imagine a country run by a dictator that simply says to Microsoft, listen, give me information about how many people in my country are sick, are this, are that, how many students we have where, Facebook, tell me, what are my citizens thinking? What do they do? Where do they hang out? That's the kind of dystopia that we're moving in and we're living towards. And we ought to resist that as much as we possibly can. So I hope that sort of kind of gives a context with what globally is the problem with surveillance capitalism, and perhaps just a few ideas about what are some of the issues that are there, but just to underline it, to say it's just about monetization of our lives, monetization of our personal information, and there's nothing to it. It's about profit making on our information, period. That's what surveillance capitalism is all about. Capitalizes on our lives, capitalizes on our information to make money, to generate money, and we cannot allow then, therefore, the same sector to want to fight for better regulation, the same sector to want to talk about or to be at the forefront of telling us how to reform the system in itself. The truth of the matter is the system is not working for the people. The system is working for capital. The system is making money for capital. And we need to resist as a citizenry of the world. And there's no better time than now to mobilize in our small ways, in our small corners, to organize and resist and push back and claim back our lives, claim back our spaces, claim back our rights. That's the only way to go. And I think I'll leave just this subject matter, at that level, and perhaps kind of delve into the manifestation of surveillance as we experience it, at least in South Africa. One of the things that I think perhaps to start with is to say we have pretty much two parallel worlds that sometimes converge. The one parallel is there's a growing appetite for corporations to invest in surveillance in the country. And then there's another section that is the government or the state in itself. Now, in South Africa, we subjected to these two parallels, processes. The one is we have, but perhaps just maybe to take a step back and say, before I get into that, just to say, in an unequal society like ours, with a history like ours, from apartheid into the democratic dispensation that we're living in now, the truth of the matter is that the apartheid regime legally, segregated Black people. Then it meant there were white spaces, then there were Black spaces, separate development, and all kinds of things that were actually regulated by the apartheid government. So what that means is to simply say the Group Areas Act, it simply meant that we're going to live according to the different groups that we were. And that was apartheid in itself. Now, what we had to do with the new dispensation was to dismantle that system and fight for greater reintegration. But the truth of the matter is that even in the quest for reintegration, there is some level of resistance, and it manifests itself through the use of surveillance to actually keep certain people away from certain spaces. I'll get into that a bit later, but thought maybe let me just give that context to simply say this is our country being a very unequal country with the history that it has. We've always had an issue with how we're going to develop as a society, and quite frankly, it simply means that we're at the mercy of two parallel structures: the corporate world or the corporations and government, right? So perhaps maybe just to say what we have in this country is a government that tried to reform the then apartheid government laws and all sorts of things, and develop their own laws and policies to try and govern certain things better, right? But what that then meant was that in the drafting of the new policies and regulations and laws and everything else, the private sector or the corporate sector always had an interest in that. So as a result, sat on the table of negotiation to have a way in which the government develops policies or laws that are not necessarily going to be clamping down on their behavior. And as a result, the government made certain concessions, and that's the reason why we then have the rollout of the problem, or perhaps the manifestation of the problem that we have in this country with surveillance, and it starts at that level. So maybe just to say, we have a government that has what they call the State Security Agency. And this is the spooks. These are spooks that are essentially tasked with ensuring we gather intelligence locally and internationally about the threats to the country and all sorts of things. But what we've seen is that the behavior of these spooks has not necessarily been serving at the behest of the nation, but it's serving at the behest of the political elites that are ruling at that particular time. So what had happened is that our previous president, our then former president, essentially polarized and politicized the State Security Agency itself, right? And by that, what he then did was to de-amalgamate the international intelligence gathering and the local intelligence gathering. And what then that meant was that you have a State Security Agency that's not necessarily spending its time trying to look at the threats that are going to, the threats to the nation or the threats to the society or the threats to the country as South Africa. But what we then had is the State Security Agency that fought political battles. And how these political battles were fought is that the State Security Agency then gets involved in political fights within the ruling party. So you use the State Security Agency, which is a state agency, to fight the ruling party, the political parties' battles within. So you start surveilling some of the political opponents within the political parties, and we thought, well, that's a problem. But then it got worse, because what then the government did under the former president was that they went in as far as surveilling even civil society organizations. Ourselves, Greenpeace, ourselves I mean the Right2Know Campaign and other civil society organizations have been flagged as some of the organizations that have been surveilled and actively monitored by the State Security Agency, during the previous president's tenure. So now, that's the one point. One is a political party using state resources to fight its own battles, and an executive or a government that essentially is so paranoid with civil society organizations holding them to account and demanding accountability and demanding transparency, ultimately using the state tools to then therefore infiltrate civil society organizations and surveil civil society organizations. And that's the one element of the state, sort of the high level state surveillance that happens of citizens, of civil society organizations in this country. And then at the same time, you have a State Security Agency that goes in as far as surveillance. I mean, this is a State Security Agency that sets itself out to surveilling some of our journalists who are uncovering ill deeds, malfeasance, and all kind of wrong behavior that happens within the state by political actors, by the political elite, by the ruling political elite as well. So ultimately, what they then do is use those to essentially go after journalists who are exposing some of these happenings within the state. And not only would they do that, but you also have a situation where the very same, for the state, the very same civil society organizations, the very same citizens in this country are also then subjected to a parallel process where, for instance, in the different municipalities across the country in South Africa, you have a mushrooming CCTV camera network that is actually being rolled out in the different municipalities across the country. A curious case of it is the city of Joburg, in Gauteng, the Joburg Metro, essentially what you have is one private company that is owned by a Johann Rupert. Johann Rupert, I mean, I'm sure anybody that has read the history of this country would understand the Rupert family and the Oppenheimer and all of that they've done. So what you have is a private company that is owned, or at least the major shareholder of this company is Rupert, essentially running a series of CCTV camera networks and fiber networks in Gauteng, illegally so. And I'm saying illegally so primarily because, one, these are folks that have no legal framework to even be using CCTV camera or surveillance cameras, even for any form of anything. Perhaps maybe just to say, one of the selling their taglines for selling surveillance, quite frankly, is the paranoia. They're running around the paranoia of people for safety, and also kind of using the chronicle of crime as a way of selling surveillance in this country. So that's the one thing that they're rallying themselves behind, to say surveillance is important, surveillance is a necessity because we're living in a violent country. Good enough, we live in a violent country, yes. We live in a crime-infested country. Of course, we live in a crime-infested country, but truth of the matter is that anywhere that surveillance has been used, what we do know is that surveillance does not decrease crime, but what surveillance does is actually displace crime. So one area that has surveillance cameras may not necessarily decrease crime. It does not mean that people are no longer conducting criminal operations, but what it simply means is that people may not go to that area, but go to another area. And then ultimately, through time, folks learn ways in which they can actually break this and essentially be able to go beyond even the limitations that are actually presented by the use of CCTV camera networks. So I think that's the one thing. So we have a CCTV camera network rollout in Gauteng that is essentially at the hands of a private company that, one, is illegally installing some of these CCTV camera networks, primarily because the city does not have the legislative framework to enable or to govern the use of CCTV cameras in that city. Now, how is it that you then have a company rolling out CCTV camera networks when in fact there is no legislation to allow them to do so? And those are some of the questions that we're actually asking at the practical level as an organization that does work with communities on the ground, to problematize the use of CCTV cameras in public spaces, because these cameras are essentially put up everywhere and anywhere, and they're collecting data. I mean, it's cameras that would have license plate recognition. To some degree, folks would say they don't have facial recognition, but I think if you look at the kind of technology that they use, they would have facial recognition as well. And these are used in public spaces, gathering data about people's cars, about people's movements, and all kinds of things. And it's unregulated in a city that has no legislative framework. And what we're trying to do now is to actually build a movement from the ground to actually push back against the installation of this, primarily because we feel it's an illegal action, primarily because there's absolutely no provision in law to actually even have the CCTV camera networks actually being rolled out in the city. So that's the one thing that we're trying to do at the practical level, at the community level, to try and push back against surveillance. And the other issue that I wanted to, or perhaps one of the other examples that I wanted to put to the fore, is to say, not only are we pushing back in that form to say we're going to hold the city accountable to how is it that you're giving people a way leave. A way leave is almost equivalent of a license to install some of these CCTV camera networks. But what we're also trying to do as a civil society organization is to actually even take the city to task, including the company as well. We're doing civil litigation on behalf of the citizens of City of Joburg to simply say we cannot have illegal cameras actually monitoring the movement of people, collecting data of people in the city. So we've also started sort of a legal case to try and challenge the use of CCTV camera networks in the City of Joburg. And the other thing that I perhaps touched on a little bit is that I hope to be able to share some of the links to these documents. The other issue that I mentioned earlier on was that we as the Right2Know campaign, we put together a report on the surveillance of journalists in the country. What we then did was to work with a number of journalists who had been actively surveilled by the government, who were exposing tender irregularities, corruption at the different municipality levels, some corruption even during the building of infrastructure during the 2010 World Cup, FIFA World Cup in this country. So, these were journalists that were actively monitored and actively surveilled with a view of actually clamping down on them and shutting them down. So what we did was to actually launch some complaints to the Inspector General of Intelligence of this country on these cases and demand that these cases be investigated. And we released the report on this to kind of look at the ways in which this surveillance takes place and the reasons behind that, and some of the things that essentially were actively done to surveil, some of these journalists that we actually profiled in the book. The other thing that we did was to, follow through and essentially monitor the implementation. So our state security agency, after all the shenanigans that they had, conducted themselves in during the presidency of our former president, ultimately the current president then started what he called the high-level panel review to look at the happenings within the state security agency. And what we have done as an organization was to even put pressure on the president to ensure that the reforms or the recommendations that were made by this panel of experts are actually followed through. I remember the president had sat on the report for a very long time, and we had written numerous times to him to put pressure on him to release the report. So we actively continue to monitor the implementation of some of these recommendations that were given by the high-level panel review on the happenings at the State Security Agency. I think I'm going to stop there for a little bit and hear if Fergus wants to probe if there's anything that I may have forgotten.
Yeah. No, thank you, Thami. That was incredibly comprehensive. And we have, as one viewer put it, a loot of questions. So with that in mind, also recognizing that over the course of your sharing, I think many of those were touched on, especially with regards to what can we do, what mechanisms are there for this trembling in indignation and the action that is required for the severity of this issue, really. But I'm going to try to synthesize some of these questions, and I'm going to launch into a question from Elena around the relationship between COVID-19 and both the tremendous use of data and even recommendations from the WHO to upscale the usage of data to track the virus to assist in combating COVID-19, recognizing that there's an inherent trade-off there, right? There's an inherent trade-off of the use, the data for good, as Branka put it, and how can we keep that good? And at the very same time, the issue of the risks that we're not so much aware of. So as Jerry put it, he was asking or pointing out that given that we're a lot of our attention is being sapped by pandemic and the lockdowns that we are experiencing as a society and the variety of other injustices, how can we become a little more aware of the risks and that trade-off with the COVID-19 surveillance upsurge? So I'm just trying to branch that.
Yeah, no. I think perhaps maybe I will try and be as brief as I possibly can. I think that's the one thing that was missing. I'm happy that it's gotten raised. When you scatter brain like me, it helps that when people ask questions. So I think maybe let me problematize this. The first thing that we did as a country during the COVID outbreak was that we opted for a contact tracing that simply meant going to the cell phone network providers and getting numbers of citizens who are recorded with these service providers, and essentially tracking it that way. Now, what that meant is that we then had to promulgate a regulation specifically with the Disaster Management Act that would look at that specifically. Now, what we did was to say, we raised an issue as R2K, in fact, with the regulations to say, but hold on, we cannot have an arbitrary surveillance or contract tracing that we don't know how it's going to unfold. Now, one of the things that we had asked was to say, what's the recourse should citizens feel that this kind of surveillance or tracking is essentially mining their own personal information. Now, the one thing is that then the regulation said they will put in place what they call a designated judge. Katie O'Regan, I think at the time it was, they would put in place a designated judge. So the Department of Health through the DG had to make a submission to the designated judge to say, here are numbers that we would like to contact trace or follow up on, because we have reasonable belief that these individuals may have been in contact with a person suspected of having COVID-19 or may have been exposed to COVID-19. And the designated judge then gives them the go-ahead to do that, but they then had to come back and report to the designated judge to say, okay, here's what we did, and here's how far we went, and here's who we specifically sort of looked at. And the designated judge would then therefore serve as a mitigation factor to ensure that the government was not breaking any rules. But then we did away with that system. As soon as we went to level 4, we did away with that system. I don't know whether it's because it didn't work or it was not going to work in the first place. But I'm not sure whether we thought it was not going to work or what the reason or the rationale for the government was. What we then did was to go with the app, because I think as things were moving forward and the response in the different parts of the world was the establishment of apps and all sorts of things, I think we went that route as well. But part of the problem for us is to say, we know very little about the app in itself. I mean, they say it uses things like Bluetooth. I don't know, because I've not downloaded the app myself, but they say it uses Bluetooth. So the truth of the matter is you will have to have your Bluetooth on all the time. If not, then how is it tracing your Bluetooth movement if your Bluetooth is off? So I think there has been some skepticism in this country, and I think it's reasonable, and that citizens aren't very clear about what this looks like.
Sure.
And we need to think about that. But I think we've used two models. Whether they've worked, whether they haven't worked, I'm not necessarily sure. I think there's very little data now in the public to know whether this is working, whether this is not working. Very little is said right now about the recourse. Should you feel that the app in itself is actually gathering data about you, how do you then go about demanding recourse? That's another thing that I don't think we've spoken about, and that remains a problem for me.
And again, it speaks to what you were alluding to earlier about regulation or response from the ground up being far behind, and that we need to fast catch up. And with that in mind, there've been a couple of questions that have come through around regulation, right? Pense referring to this as a mammoth task, and recognizing that with regulation behind, should we advocate to own our data? Is this too big a task? Also, Kense later on commenting, is it even possible to think about advocating for an abolishment of surveillance capitalism as a whole, in the same way that you reference other issues of past and present? There were a couple of echoes of that same sentiment, sort of what does that look like? And then with regards to this regulation question, Caleb also asking, well, when it comes to regulation, how is the South African government applying surveillance in a similar model? And to what degree are they doing it with corporations? And or are there other channels that are currently known or ought to be known by the public? So for now, just those regulation-oriented questions and impressions.
Yeah, look, I think the regulations one is it's a bit dicey, primarily because, I mean, look, we as soon as COVID hit, what we then had was the National Command Center, right? And an interministerial body with the president making all these decisions and all sorts of things. So it simply meant that we had, because it's a disaster management act that is being used because it's a state of disaster. It meant we quickly had to give away our right to even engage with these processes, to even ask questions of these processes. What it simply meant is that ultimately it will be left to some civil society organizations to take the government to task with regards to how they promulgate in these regulations and what these regulations meant. And that's the thing that we seek to do as well. But it simply meant that we quickly had to give away some of our rights, even our right to assemble, and even our right to protest, even our right to do anything, because we are living in a pandemic. And power became centralized to a few individuals who were making decisions about what we should do and what we shouldn't do. So I would say the first thing that's problematic with the regulations is to say they were not consultative in their very nature. I know the NCC always came out, or the president always came out and said, no, we are consulting. But the truth of the matter is, who were they consulting? Big business, right? Corporations and everybody else. But they were not consulting with civil society that at least is a microcosm of a larger society as well. We're not consulting with civil society, we're not consulting with society. So as a result, but we also understand it's an imperfect process. This is the first ever time that we had to use the Disaster Management Act in our history. So it was going to be imperfect, but I think the lessons that we learn from that is to simply say, we shouldn't take the regulations as they come. We must understand that there are limitations to how we can exercise our rights. But the truth of the matter is we have a stake in informing what these regulations become. Because what we needed was a government that's going to regulate together with the citizen as a response, not a government that's going to regulate against the citizens. What we saw was a clampdown, a law enforcement, a clampdown with the regulations. We had the army deployment, and suddenly we became a militarized state, a police state in a matter of hours. And that's where the problem was. So we had very little interaction with the regulations, and we thought we had a government that scared us into submission instead of negotiating with us on a way out of the situation that we found ourselves in. And that's where part of the problem with the regulations actually begin. So even anything that flows from there may not necessarily be responsive to what we needed or what we still need, even in terms of how we respond to COVID-19. So everything that was done there is trial and error, and everything that was done there, quite frankly, had a remnants. It stinks of authoritarianism. It stinks of, and somebody may say perhaps we're being paranoid, but the truth of the matter is that any state that has an ability to peep on its citizens' behaviors, thoughts, actions will take up that option. And that's why I've always been worried about a state-controlled surveillance, even in response to COVID. But if it's state-controlled, we have serious problems with that and how that plays itself out at the later stage. I don't think they want to relinquish that level of power, if they have it, to be able to surveil all of us in the way that they promulgated to do.
Especially, there are a few comments in the chat concerning this recognition that the product, as it were, of this massive data harvesting on a lot of these social media platforms and other platforms that we use, it's us, but at a further down the line, it's the anticipation and the anticipation and influence of behavior. And so, as you say, the recognition of the dangers of state-oriented surveillance in connection with that insight around behavior prediction, analytics, and influence is massive. As you say, it stinks. It reeks of tyranny. So with that on the go and on the flow, and there are a couple of questions around the commodification question, which is something you touched right in the beginning on, pertaining to the bigger picture of surveillance capitalism in the world. There's a question from Sanjay, basically asking, well, how exactly, can you say a little more about how the mechanisms of how money is made by, for instance, taking a photo of a house, or Google having that kind of access to imagery? I think providing a little more sense of the mechanisms by which that data is commodified may be helpful. And second to that, a comment again from Elena, asking, do you think there are any ways that we can influence that surveillance capitalism business model. Of course, there's the taxation sort of option of, can we tax companies for the amount of data they own, and the resultant change of incentives that may lead to. But that's still government, that's still regulation, that still requires a sort of a step of distance between us and this issue. So just a commentary on the commodification issue, the mechanisms, and how we might be able to influence that business model. There's and I just want to tie it in with two other questions. One from Lisa asking, is another way to affect this as a user, as a customer, to support different search engines? Are there different platforms that we ought to be a little more aware of? And also from Maud asking, ultimately, are there recommendations as to what we can do tomorrow, what we can do on Monday morning, in terms of the sort of reimagining how we use these platforms?
Okay. All right. No. Perhaps maybe start with Helena. I think that with Helena's question is to say, I don't think there's any form of taxation. Look, you go to the US, every tech meeting that is there, even at university, is sponsored by Microsoft, right? And you look at how much Microsoft puts in the prison industrial system in the US, insofar as making money off prisoners, even with the tag that they have. If you have a house arrest, you do your sentence and you under house arrest, you're monitored. The monitoring devices are Microsoft's. I think big tech has an upper hand. I don't know how taxing them, we may tax them and they may increase the prices, and the state needs these things from them. I'm not necessarily sure whether that works. I'm at heart an abolitionist, and for me, big tech has to go. Big tech has to go in a way that it needs to be informed by human needs. They can impose what they want from us. Can we have a conversation about what does humanity need to be able to move forward? And we define that, and not be subjected to what somebody else think is what human evolution needs for the next 10 years, for the next 5 years, or whatever the case might be. I know I'm not answering the question, but for me, no, I don't believe even taxing them would help us in any way. If you think about the situation of Uyghur Muslims in China, if China taxes Hilkinson that manufactures those cameras, does that make them any poorer? No, but the subjects of this kind of surveillance apartheid remains. And for me, even the conversation about taxes is at a higher level, and we know how corporations lobby, support politicians and policymakers. Our own State Capture Commission tells you that we cannot trust the relationship between politicians and corporations to be sane, to be fair, to be in the interest of a citizen. So I don't know. I don't think that can be done. And perhaps maybe the question around the examples. When you're in Gauteng, the license plate recognition, what it does is every time you move underneath the gantry, the camera, it takes your registration number. Suddenly, you see, so this company is called Vumacam. So suddenly, you see Vumacam has an advertising of My Way, a motor vehicle company, advertised on their lamp. What does that tell you? If you can get a person's license plate number, you can get a person's name, you can get a person's cell phone. And that's what they do. Telemarketing, selling each other of information. And then suddenly, when you went past that camera, 2 days later, you're getting a call from My Way selling you insurance. How do you think that happens, right? So I'm just simply saying, part of the problem is a whole web of information changing. Somebody says gold used to be the thing back in the 60s, but right now data is the new gold. You go to a bank, suddenly you use your biometrics, you do this, you do that, you do that. You go to an ATM that is not yours, even if you're using cash send or something. After you withdraw the money that I may have sent to Vegas, it asks you who you are. As soon as you tell it who you are, and then suddenly you're getting, advertisements of certain this, of that, products of this, a product of that, right? Our phones are forever. How do you think most of my money was campaigning on my phone when I've never given anybody the DA my numbers? Suddenly you get an automated message from most of my money campaigning, hey, this is Musi, da 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 da. Yeah. And that's how it works, the telemarketers, and that's how they solve data. It's to just exchange data from each other. And that's maybe, I forget there was the last comment which I thought was very useful, Fergus, if you would remind me.
Yes.
There was the last
it had to do with sort of immediately on Monday morning, how might we imagine resisting, whether it's other platforms or boycotting Facebook, these kinds of questions.
Yeah, no. So what we have done as the Right2Know campaign, we've developed a toolkit called People's Tech. People's Tech, People's Power. Yes, that's the manual. It's called People's Tech for People's Power. It has useful tools about the kinds of things that you can do to protect yourself online. It tells you alternatives to Facebook, alternatives to WhatsApp, alternatives to other things, a much more safer options. For example, instead of WhatsApp, you would rather use Signal. There's an app called Signal. Instead of using your usual browser, there's a browser called Tor. So we have a tool like that. It's accessible online on our website. Folks can go there, get the copy. It has very useful things, practical step on a daily basis. It talks about, the need to have a 2-pin prompt option on your phone and all kinds of things. So yeah, we have a tool like that is on our website that will help you look at the different alternatives. Quite frankly, there's a lot that we can do. We just often don't know what is it that we can do. And I'm saying there is information like that. You go to tor.com, tor.com. They have tools there. R2K has tools with the manual that we just developed now to say practically what is it that you can do. What other softwares that are there that are far much better and much more safer to use than these ones. It goes in as far as explaining to say, even if you're in a protest, sometimes the police use stingrays. When people don't know that, sometimes the police use stingrays to actually hack into your phone and actually see your messages as you're talking and all sorts of things. So it's some of the stuff that we've developed into that toolkit that gives you a practical step by step. So what we're saying is that let's take the technology and put it into the people's power. So that's why we say people's tech, people's tech for people's power. So we want a technology that is people-centered. And that's the struggle that we're trying to take forward moving from here.
Thank you very much for that, Thami. I've popped that link in the chat for everybody who would like to go and have a look at that toolkit, a guide to digital self-defense and empowerment. So I want to move on as we start to rope in and come to a close. I'd like to move around to Julie's asking, can you help us to imagine what does non-surveillance look like? It's, sort of a theme that's been coming up over the course of Build Peace 2020 is sort of how can we focus on what is good, what is beautiful, what might it look like? What might that look like for our daily lives, for the way that we assemble, for the way that we organize? And along with that, sort of Maud is echoing that remark by asking, in her words, what does abolishing surveillance capitalism look like? How can we imagine it in order to inform our practice? And at the same time, keeping in mind Branka's suggestion or concern, how do we keep the good, right? How do we keep the services and all the benefits that we obviously have accessible to us through these technologies? Tricky question. And finally, sort of wrapping up that pack of questions is, with this sort of, how do we envision a non-surveillance capitalism society? How do we become a little more solutionary around getting us there? Solutionary, as Emmanuel Pratt from yesterday's keynote referenced, so proactive, not only in our daily practices online, but also in the way that we gather, the way that we inform one another about the risks and the possible rewards if we can move away from a surveillance capitalism captured society.
Whew. Yeah, no, that's a mouthful. I'm trying to think. I don't think there is. Look, I think some technologies are useful. If we have areas like we have in the Eastern Cape, for example, where it's very difficult to reach by car, and you have an old grandmother that needs their monthly dosage of diabetes medication or whatever the case might be, we're not talking that kind of technology. I think we need to be clear to say if technology moves people forward, a grandmother somewhere is able to get access to medication, even though the place that she lives in may not necessarily be accessible by car or by road or whatever. If there's a drone that can drop off grandma's medication, I don't think we oppose that. What we're saying is to say you cannot be a company that uses your capability, or a corporation that uses your capability to influence how I live, influence how I think, invade my space, sell what you know about me to the next person, and make me, almost making every element of my life vulnerable to capital, in a sense that whatever it is that you know about me, when you share it, you make money off me. And that person is going to make money off me. And that person is going to make, so every area of my life, somebody's making profit of it. But I remain not in charge. I did not consent to that. I don't have the proceeds of that. But everybody else is making money out of my life. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. To say we cannot allow companies to function with impunity in a level that they're not going to they're not going to ask us for consent to use certain tools, for example. It needs to be an open discussion. It needs to be an open space that simply says, listen, we're developing this for humanity because we think it'll make it better. And then we simply say, right, we don't agree with this, we don't agree with that. This element can remain because we see this as necessity, as helpful for us moving forward, but not this one, not that one. Because the regulatory framework of it is problematic. South Africa has the Promotion of Personal Information, Protection of Personal Information Act. That in itself is not doing enough. Continuously, companies like Vumacam and others are continuously treating us as data subjects. We lodge complaints there, and then POPI is not fully effective in itself. And then, the Office of the Information Regulator is underfunded. So even in essence, even where there is regulation and we're trying to say we'll regulate better, we'll hold these companies to account, those instruments are weak in themselves. And we need to then think about how best do we then engage in a conversation that simply says, can there be responsible tech? I don't know. At the level at which I sit, I would like to live my life free of cameras. And perhaps I'm speaking as a privileged young man living in the city, as a middle class. Perhaps that's where I'm coming from. But quite frankly, I don't want to be living under constant watchful eye of a big brother. I don't want that. When I close my door, I want to close my door and know that nobody gives a damn about what's going on, or nobody's interested in what I'm doing. And that's how, and that's a constitutional right for me. What we're simply saying is that anything and everything that anybody does should be put to the test of the constitutional rights that we all have. And should they be infringing on that, should not be not in line with that, then we must have a problem with it. The same way that we had a problem with RICA. The Ministry of Police utilizes RICA to suddenly tap people's phones, tap journalists' phones, tap whistleblowers' phones, tap activist phones. We cannot have that. That's a policy, but it's being abused. And the truth of the matter is that do we then sit back and say, yeah, but it helps here and there. But in truth, what it does is regressively eroding the rights of people in this country, the citizens of this country, to be themselves and self-determine. And we cannot necessarily allow things like that to happen. I don't know whether we can live in a technology-free world. I don't think that's possible. And perhaps that's a conversation that I don't think I have all the answers, but I think that's a conversation that we should all have. I don't know whether there is what is called responsible technology. Technology by its very nature is very evasive.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's the best way to move forward, quite frankly. Unfortunately for everyone here, I'm here to problematize, and I don't have the answers, quite frankly. And I think we shouldn't have the answers, but this is the beginning of a conversation of dialogue, to simply reimagine and rethink about these things, what these things mean to our lives. What we have done in the past 10 years is to live with these things and never had a conversation. And for me, this is the beginning of saying, let's put the issues into the public discourse. None of us have the answers. But the good thing about transformation, about development of any society, is for us to engage on these things and actually problematize what is wrong, and perhaps hold each other accountable where something is working. Let's have this debate. But the important thing is humanity defining the use of these things, and not these things defining humanity and what humanity becomes.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. There was a one of the contributors to the conference yesterday, Sanjay from Seoul, Colombia, which, if I remember correctly, means self-organized learning environments. He was putting on the table this thing of this platform for starting the big conversations that count and getting mass inclusion and synthesizing that so that we can start broadcasting collective voice more effectively and more proactively. And that's what you're saying, right? We need to start having the conversation. It may be too soon to put forward those emancipatory ambitions of a vision of a abolished surveillance capitalism. Technology is with us, and by its very nature tools us, as Elena would say in last year and the year before's conference. How does it tool us? Let's start bringing that to the surface. Let's start raising the conversation and giving space for it, right? So with all that said, we have come to a close, and there are two more questions down here. I guess 3 comments, but 2 questions. One about self-regulation. So do we see private industries coming forward and self-regulating? I'm guessing that's probably a quick response from you. And similarly, Sanjay Fernandez makes the comment, should these corporations be public services owned by everybody? I just want to cover those 2 before we do some wrapping up of the conversation.
Should they be publicly owned? Yeah, perhaps. I think so. No, a socialist in me simply says people should have a stake on these things, and so I agree. But as I don't know. Self-regulation? No, I don't buy it. Look, I think we are where we are. It's gotten worse because we've let the regulation or the self-regulatory framework lie in the hands of big tech, and this is where we are, why we are here, right? Cambridge Analytica happened because we thought, they putting lead on themselves, they restraining themselves, they regulating themselves. But here we are now. It's the same thing as saying we have a government that we hope is going to hold itself accountable. It doesn't work. It does not work at all. And I think the biggest danger for me is that what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement is the dangers of surveillance. If we're going to stand up against police repression, and the next day 2, 3, 5 of us are picked up by virtue of the lengths of the cameras in the different cities, then we're in trouble.
Thank you for that. And then in the interest of touching on all questions coming forward, we had a question from Mark, one of your comrades, sort of that touches on exactly that. If surveillance capitalism is a problem, do you agree that the solution is socialism or communism?
I'd say so.
But it says so. And then still open is just a reflection from a sounder who's basically sharing that, from the level of forgetting our roots of true African education and recognizing the dangers of forgetting that, forgetting other ways of knowing, I guess, other ways of organizing and communicating to some degree, and in favor of the sort of control-oriented ordering. That was his comment.
Yeah.
And I wonder, with that comment in mind, which provides an overarching perspective on a lot of the issues that are coming to the fore now at this time, if you could provide us with a few more minutes, or just anything else to close the session, and then I'll close off with a couple of announcements of what's next.
Yeah. No, I think maybe first just to thank everybody for joining us, and I hope perhaps, for me it was just to spark a debate, to spark a conversation, and because I think there isn't enough happening in the public discourse in this country and elsewhere, around the issue of big tech and surveillance and stuff. And I think it's about time that we start having these conversations. Anything that exists with us ought to be engaged with and dissected in a way that makes sense to humanity. And I think for me, today's session was not necessarily to try and provide answers or to try and perhaps, take people in a particular line of thinking, but essentially to simply say, look, we have a problem, and that's a fact, we have a problem, and can we think better about how best we attend to this problem? And say, and I'm grateful for this opportunity, and hopefully this is the beginning of a much broader conversation moving forward. Apologies for my nervousness. I stutter a little bit when I'm a bit nervous, but thank you so much for joining us.
That did not come across at all. Rather, I think by the nature of the loot of questions that we had, the engagements, the comments on the chat, the appreciation is most definitely both ways. And like you say, I think a lot of us are very much looking forward to continuing this conversation. And I would personally like to figure out quite soon what that means in practice and how we can keep connected, specifically with the Build Peace's broader community, bringing together global perspectives that connect and where we can learn from one another on how to tremble in indignation at this issue and take agency and take action. So with that in mind, I'd like to remind everybody that we're keying off on the main stage, and the series of short talks on urban space is next, coming from Wafaya Bulalala, Diana Ochola, Michael Lenihan, and I think Kate and Julie will be moderating that or providing the Q&A session. So that's what's next. Stay tuned, and we look forward to your continued participation as we come to a close of this incredible Build Peace 2020. Let's make this place beautiful. Thank you so much, Thami Nkosi. It's been a great pleasure. I'll see you, Nana.
Thank you so much, bro.